Thank you kindly, Mr. President. So I noticed right in the beginning in Section 1, it says in any motor vehicle. And I just want to set a question for the record whether or not we are including things beyond cars and passenger trucks, but also would this bill apply to motorcycles or to campers, other types of motorized vehicles on our roads? Through Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Mr. President. And through you, Mr. President, the answer to that would be found in line 12, or actually lines 11 and 12, where C begins the answer to the question as motor vehicles defined as the definition given in Section 14.1 of the statutes. I don't remember that off the top of my head, but I could look it up and read it to you if you would like, through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. You have the floor, Senator Sampson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. I'm familiar with Section 14-1, and I know it does include motorcycles, which I guess is just a question that I wanted to get on the record, partly because motorcycles obviously pose a different set of issues than automobiles do when you're being asked to store your firearm. I also noticed that the bill is very specific to age 21, and I would assume that's because this bill applies only to pistols and revolvers and not to long guns. Is that correct through you, Mr. President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield, would you care to reply?
Through you, Mr. President, I believe that to be correct, but I'm not sure which section the good senator is talking about, and just so I don't say something that is not correct, I would ask if he could point out the line so that I could verify. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I'm referring to lines 5 and 6, where it says motor vehicles unattended if no person is at least age 21 who is the owner or operator of such a motor vehicle is inside and within close proximity to the motor vehicle to prevent unauthorized access. And I noticed that we use the age 21, and I was just asking if what the purpose was of choosing 21 versus 18 or even 16. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield, do you care to respond?
Through you, Mr. President, I think that has to do with ongoing conversations about responsibility and ability to think in certain situations. I will say that I wasn't involved in that portion of the drafting, so what I represent I believe to be true, but I cannot verify that at the moment. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. And I noticed this bill does specifically only mention pistols and revolvers. And for the record, this does not apply to rifles. Is that correct, through Mr. President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, for line, in answer to Senator Sampson, in line 10 and line 11, the bill specifies that it does mean, in fact, pistol and revolver as defined in sections 29 through 27 of the general statute.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Hey, thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the answers. I just wanted to get that set of circumstances on the record. So I see that it says that it is perfectly acceptable, and I'm glad that these changes were adopted in the House, that someone could store their pistol or revolver in a locked trunk, a locked safe, or a locked glove box. But do I read that correctly to assume that simply having it in a locked car is not satisfactory? Through you, Mr. President.
Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I will answer that by expanding upon the example. I think this would be acceptable to Senator Sampson. If one were to have their pistol or revolver in the car, for instance, in the back seat, and the car is locked, that would not be acceptable. Through you, Mr. President.
Thanks. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. I'm not sure I heard exactly what you said or understood it, and I'm very sorry for that. Just to reiterate, the question is, I understand locked safe, locked glove box, locked trunk, but if the vehicle itself is not locked and it's in the locked glove box or not in the locked glove box, what are the circumstances? Does the car require to be locked too? Or if the car is not locked, but the glove box is? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, do think that that's a slightly different question than I had perceived, but I will say that what this bill talks about is, as Senator Sampson pointed out, the trunk being locked, the box being locked, and those things. And so I would suggest that the reading of the bill that I have is that those parts of the vehicle, if they're considered parts of the vehicle, must be locked. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that's all the questions I have. I'll let the gentleman sit down. This just speaks to just the overall confusion I have with this bill. I think it's got a good intent. We're trying to prevent firearms falling into the hands of criminals by them being stolen out of parked vehicles. I think that makes a lot of sense. There are a number of ways we can approach that, and I'm just not certain that this bill gets to that, because in some ways I think we're preventing the owner of the vehicle from making their own decisions about the proper way to store their firearm in a way that's best to secure it and to make sure it's not stolen by setting these parameters. I'm also curious to understand why we would go through the trouble of making this requirement for pistols and revolvers but leave rifles alone. So presumably under this language, you can store your rifle out in the open in your vehicle, and that's not a crime. But yet, if you lock your car and the gun is in the glove box, that is a crime. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I wonder also about what happens when someone steals a car. Now, clearly that's a crime on its own, but is there any liability for the person who owned the car to begin with for the way they stored the firearm at that time? And in our laws in Connecticut, it is a requirement that you must report a stolen firearm. So if someone steals a firearm from a vehicle and that person goes to report it, could they find themselves in trouble? In fact, I'll ask that question of the proponent of the bill. Could you ultimately put yourself at risk of being guilty, I believe, of a Class A misdemeanor for reporting the theft of your firearm from your vehicle through you, Mr. President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I guess I would have to ask for more details on the situation. I'm not sure what the question is asking. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, could you clarify the question?
Certainly. I came up with one scenario, which I will repeat, which is someone owns a vehicle, the car is locked, they have a handgun that is in the glove box, but the glove box is not locked. I believe that would make them liable under this bill for a Class A misdemeanor in the first offense. If someone were to steal that firearm under those circumstances and that person reported it, would they be subject to prosecution? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I will say that if the individual reporting should have secured the firearm under the provisions of this bill should it become law, and they did not, and they reported it, it is within the realm of possibility that there's a prosecution. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. So that's interesting. I almost think that it might have been a worthwhile endeavor to provide some sort of immunity if the person reports the stolen firearm, since our ultimate goal is to keep that firearm off the streets in its entirety. I guess that's my main issue with this bill, is it covers some of the things. I would much rather see legislation that maybe created a crime for someone leaving their firearm exposed on the passenger seat of the car, creating an attractive nuisance for someone to create a crime. But I can see people who, again, trying to do the right thing, getting caught up and becoming responsible when they were not, intending to commit a crime. I also I have a question about line 6. It says, for the purposes of this section, a motor vehicle is unattended if no person who is at least 21 years of age is within close enough proximity. So if someone stops at a gas station or a Dunkin' Donuts, say, and they leave their car for the very few minutes to run into the store, would that qualify as leaving the vehicle unattended and therefore create liability under this bill if it becomes law? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I think it depends on the circumstances of that particular situation. Simply leaving the vehicle, of course, does not. I think it depends upon whether or not the individual is able to prevent that unauthorized access, and that is a matter of the circumstances on the ground as we look at that individual circumstance. I will say this, while I did answer the previous question, the further question was not asked about, so what happens if there's the possibility of a charge being brought? And if you look at lines 53, going forward down to section 2 there, which is on line 58, the court can order a suspension of the prosecution if that individual reported the circumstances or the facts that report the crime that the good senator was asking about. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thanks again to the gentleman for the answers to his questions. And this time I'm not going to ask any more questions. I do, however, Mr. President, have a number of amendments. The very first one I'd like to offer is LCO 8744. I asked the clerk call it, and then I'll be allowed to summarize.
Senate will stand at ease for just a moment. Mr. Clerk, call the amendment, please.
LCO number 8744, Senate Schedule A.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is a very straightforward amendment. It would change in Section 1 the crime of stealing a firearm from a Class C to a Class B felony, in effect increasing the penalty. Through you, Mr. President. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I got sidetracked. I move adoption, and I would ask that when the vote is taken, it be taken by roll.
Thank you. The amendment has been moved, and a roll call will be ordered at the appropriate time at the end of debate. Will you remark further on the amendment? Senator Sampson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. And sorry, I've got a lot of papers in front of me. I'm trying to keep my documents straight. The intention of this bill, I think, is quite clear, and that is to prevent firearms from falling into the hands of criminals. And it does that in the bill before us by punishing the owner of the firearm if they are somehow lax in the way they secure it, which is certainly a worthwhile approach if done correctly. This change that I have here, I think, is a much more direct approach, which it makes a much more significant penalty in the case of someone who would steal that firearm by increasing that from a Class C to a Class B felony. And I encourage my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Will you remark further on the amendment? Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in objection to the amendment. Mr. President, the increase in the penalty suggested by the amendment I do not believe to be the correct approach for several reasons. One, the class of penalty that we already have, which is a felony, is not an insignificant punishment. There's nothing to my mind that necessarily suggests that increasing the penalty would do us any better than we currently would have under the law. Also, the reality is that this is a to my mind, a good piece of law, and I would not like it to have to go back through this process simply to increase a penalty, which we have no reason to believe would make anyone more safe than they already are. So I would rise an objection.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Will you remark further on the amendment? Will you remark further on Senate Amendment Schedule A? If not, Mr. Clerk, if you would please call for a roll call vote on Senate Amendment Schedule A.
Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. House Bill 7223, Senate Amendment A, LCO 8744. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate on Senate Amendment A, LCO 8744. Immediate roll call vote in the Senate.
Have all the senators voted? Have all the senators voted? The machine will be closed, and Mr. Clerk, would you please announce the tally?
House Bill 7223, Senate Amendment A, LCO number 8744. Total number voting 35. Total number voting yea 13. Total voting nay 22. Absent not voting 1.
Amendment fails. Senator Sampson. Good evening.
Good evening, Madam President. Nice to see you up there. Yeah, so that's unfortunate. The bill before us, again, only addresses a certain small percentage of firearms. It does not address rifles. And there were those few inconsistencies that I mentioned earlier, including the fact that the new law we would be creating would not even apply to someone leaving a rifle on the passenger seat of their car unlocked. But yet, it would still penalize someone who put a handgun in their glove box out of sight and locked the car. To me, that's an inconsistency that I don't think is appropriate. And I thought that a more direct approach, which rather than penalizing the person who would be the victim of the crime of having their firearm stolen, that we would approach the offender directly by increasing the penalty for stealing the firearm in the first place. And that's unfortunate. Much like the previous bill, which dealt with safe storage of firearms in the home, this bill deals with safe storage of the firearms in a car. And again, it would require some people. I know that there are changes made in the House that improve the bill dramatically, allowing someone to use their glove box, and in the case of some folks who have pickup trucks, to be able to use their toolbox in the back. But there's a great number of people who live in our state that drive SUVs, and they don't have such a place to store firearms. And as a result, I have another amendment, Madam President. This one is LCO 9148. I ask that it be called, that the clerk call it, and I'd be allowed to summarize.
Mr. Clerk.
LCO number 9148, Senate Schedule B.
Senator Sampson, please proceed to summarize.
Thank you, Madam President. This is a very straightforward amendment. It strikes the underlying bill, and like was attempted on the previous bill, it would replace this the bill with a credit for the purchase of a gun safe. Again, creating a genuine incentive to gun owners to store their firearms properly instead of creating a crime that is going to only apply in some cases, and in my view, under a law that, if this passes in its current format, is ill-conceived and poorly written. This is straightforward. It says to people, buy a gun safe. It's a good thing to do. You get a credit. And I move adoption, Madam President, and I would ask that when the vote is taken, it be taken by roll. Thank you.
Thank you. A roll call will be ordered after discussion on this amendment. Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise in objection to the amendment. I think, obviously, the amendment striking the bill as the proponent of the bill, to my mind, is a bad thing. I also think that many SUVs I know have glove boxes, and the bill allows for that as a method of locking the pistol or revolver, as well as having in a box of some sort. So I think the amendment before us is not a good amendment given what we are attempting to do here today, and I rise in objection. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? If not, Mr. Clerk, would you kindly call the roll, and the machine will be opened.
Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. House Bill 7223, Senate Amendment B, LCO number 9148. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Senate Amendment B, LCO 9148. Immediate roll call vote in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Senate Amendment B, LCO number 9148. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate.
Have all the senators voted? Have all the senators voted? The machine will be locked, and Mr. Clerk, would you please announce the tally?
Senate Amendment B, LCO number 9148. Total number voting 35. Total number voting yea 13. Total voting nay 22. Absent not voting 1.
Amendment fails. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. As we have been discussing, the goal of this bill is to encourage folks to store their firearms in a safe and secure manner to prevent the theft and the potential for these firearms to end up on our streets and potentially involved in crime. Something that I am very, very concerned about. And I know that we're going to do another bill today, and I plan to speak at length about that subject in particular. There was another inconsistency that I mentioned with the bill that's before us that is something that came up during the public hearing and also once the bill passed in the House of Representatives. And several folks approached me and said that we really should address this concern. And that is a situation where someone might be on their way to the gun range to practice because they're involved in target shooting, or they're going hunting, or they're doing something like this. And the bill is very specific about saying that a motor vehicle is unattended if the owner or operator or passenger is not within close enough proximity to prevent unauthorized access. And you know, one of the issues with this bill is that we live in a world where there's a great many places that you cannot carry your firearm. The post office, a lot of government buildings, even some movie theaters. So it presents a problem for folks who do want to follow their Second Amendment right to carry a firearm on their person. They would have to take that firearm off and leave it in their vehicle to enter that place. And this is how this issue comes about. And we heard a lot of testimony about concerns about folks having to get out of their car and being exposed while they're putting the firearm in the trunk. And more people are going to be aware that these firearms are out there, potentially creating a situation where a criminal might witness them do it and start the process of a crime. Something we want to avoid. One of the very similar situations that was brought up, though, is folks that might simply just want to get out of their vehicle once they stop for gas, or they stop to get a coffee, something like that. And I'm afraid that the language in the bill would potentially put them at risk because they simply, while doing their due diligence and securing the firearm in the car, they go into the gas station and then come back. So I have a very simple amendment to resolve this issue, Madam President. It is LCO 8740. I'd ask that you have the clerk call this amendment and I be allowed to summarize.
Mr. Clerk, please call the amendment.
LCO number 8740, Senate Schedule C.
Senator Sampson, please proceed to summarize.
Thank you, Madam President. In line 3, this would add the words after unattended for an extended period of time, It's a very simple amendment. I move adoption, Madam President, and I would ask that when the vote is taken, it be taken by roll.
Thank you, sir. The amendment will be taken by roll, a roll call vote. Would any other senators care to remark? Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Senator Whitkos.
Thank you, Madam President. If I may, a question or two to the proponent of the amendment.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Madam President. And through you, I was over on the other side of the chamber discussing another bill with another senator, and I missed one part of what the amendment does. Is this a strike-all amendment through you, Madam President?
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. No, it is not. It simply adds a few words to make it quite clear that leaving the car unattended, we would be changing it to leaving unattended for an extended period of time, allowing someone to go into a gas station or a Dunkin' Donuts, something like that, and come out and not be in violation of this law. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Whitkos.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Senator Sampson for that answer. That's the only question that I have. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a good amendment and should be supported. I know there's been talk about the display of firearms, or could be termed open carry, and by allowing this amendment to take place, somebody that, in the example that Senator Sampson gave, could run into the convenience store real quick, pick something up, or run into a local bathroom, or run into the front office of a school if they're picking up their child, where they're not allowed in a gun-free zone to do so without having to get out of the car, potentially walking out to the back, locking up the weapon into a trunk. And again, this doesn't change the bill. It adds on. It doesn't strike it. It's not a strike-all. It adds a little extra, I would say, I don't want to say convenience, because not only is it a convenience, but it's a bill that, in the examples that I gave, would cause less alarm if somebody saw somebody walking around outside of their car with a gun trying to put it in the car. I urge the Chamber's adoption of the amendment. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Whitkos. Will you remark further? Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise in opposition to the amendment before us. I recognize what it is attempting to do. I think it does have a significant change to what the underlying bill is attempting to do. Madam President, I listened as the conversation spoke about the brandishing, if you will, of the weapon in order to put it into the trunk. I don't think that's necessarily required to do. I think there are ways to put the weapon in the trunk without exposing it to everyone. I also think that depending on what the situation is, if we've thought about where we were going, the weapon could be in the trunk or in the glove compartment or somewhere that could be locked when you get out of the car. If you have a box, that certainly is the case. So I think there are plenty of ways that a person who wants to transport their weapon is able to do so and not make everyone who's around them who may not be someone who understands guns feel insecure, and I would rise in opposition to the amendment. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Will you remark further? Senator Bizzarro. Good evening.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam President. Madam President, I just rise, just in listening to the debate between my colleagues here. I had a couple thoughts. I do worry with respect to this bill if it passes. I worry about a scenario where if I pull into the post office in downtown New Britain in the middle of the afternoon, I've got a firearm on me, I'm going to have to, if I don't have a locked glove box, I'll have to get out of the car, and I'll have to, take the gun off of my person, lock it up in the trunk. People might see me. It might cause panic. And I understand the senator from the 10th District's point about there being ways to do that without causing alarm and doing it discreetly. But just for the record, Madam President, I think part of the problem that I have personally with these types of bills is that, yeah, there may be ways of doing it, but now we're putting an undue burden on people who are doing nothing but just exercising their right to possess a firearm. I mean, so now somebody's got to figure out a way to be discreet about doing something that's not illegal at all. And I think that's the problem. And yes, maybe in this particular instance, in a vacuum, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But everything, Madam President, is related. Everything we do here is related. And we continue to chip away at our Second Amendment rights when we pass bills that really don't have the effect that they purport to have. And so I think that we really need to be guarded against doing that. Because at the end of the day, all it does is just galvanize the pro-Second Amendment, the vigilant pro-Second Amendment groups. So I would just urge caution to all of my colleagues around the circle, and just keep that in mind, that perspective, that the more we try to pass legislation that really does nothing in terms of protecting people, but galvanizes the opposition, we're just not getting anywhere. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Bizzarro. Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Senator Minor. Good evening.
Good evening, Madam President. I would just like to say that I'd like to align myself with the comments offered by Senator Bizzarro. I think statistics will bear out that tomorrow morning, or the next day, or the day after that, gun sales in the state of Connecticut will have gone up, not down. My constituents are very concerned about some of the gotcha moments, not in the bill that we just passed, but certainly in this legislation, where, as some of my colleagues have said, a simple stop for a cup of coffee, where someone actually gets out of the vehicle, takes their gun out from underneath the jacket where it was not in plain sight and put it in a trunk, now alerts people that there's a gun in the trunk. And so what could have easily been put in an armrest for the 5 minutes you're in a coffee shop will now become a crime. And so I do think that there is great wisdom in what Senator Bizzarro has said, and I would urge us to support this amendment in the hopes that we make this bill better. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Minor. Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Senator Champagne.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise because when I look at this law and the way it's constructed, this is a locked vehicle. When I lock my vehicle, whatever I have in my vehicle that I'm legally able to carry, it belongs to me. And I think what the creation of this was in case somebody breaks into my vehicle and steals from me. Yet when I look around at the cases that are before our courts, one of the first charges that's always dropped is the firearms charge, especially if there's any type of mandatory sentence. So now, if you put your gun in your car and somebody breaks into your car and steals it, I'm required to report it. When I report it, I get arrested because it wasn't in a locked compartment. So now I'm the victim of a crime being victimized by the state. That is just wrong. That's why I will not support this law. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Champagne. Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? If not, Mr. Clerk, would you kindly call a roll call vote, and the machine will be open.
Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. House Bill 7223, Senate Amendment C, LCO number 8740. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Senate Amendment C, LCO 8740. Immediate roll call vote in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote in the Senate. Senate Amendment C, LCO number 8740. Immediate roll call vote in the Senate.
Have all the senators voted? Have all the senators voted? The machine will be locked, and Mr. Clerk, would you please announce the tally?
Senate Amendment C, LCO number 8740. Total number voting 35. Total voting yay 14. Total number voting nay 21. Absent not voting 1.
Amendment fails. Will you remark further on the bill that is before us? Senator Minor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise for some remarks, please, on the bill.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, throughout my time in the legislature, when we've had conversations about what I call gun bills, and I think many of my constituents refer to as gun bills, we always end up having a conversation about prosecution. And Madam President, the statistics are rather striking. In almost every case, when there has been a charge filed including a firearm, at least in the majority of them, they've been nollied, not prosecuted. Any number of different positions taken, but no one is ever convicted. And that is consistently a struggle that my constituents express to me, that why do we put these bills, these laws on the books and then not prosecute people? Why do we find some level of sympathy, empathy, acceptance for people that want to commit a crime, whether it's kidnapping, armed robbery, the list goes on and on, Madam President, and yet the penalty never follows the action. And here we are again with another bill. I had a conversation, I've had a number of conversations about the legislation that we're going to vote on here this evening, and it's claimed that the reason for this legislation is that somehow guns are taken out of vehicles. And statistically, that doesn't seem to be the case. The majority of gun-related incidents aren't necessarily born out of my neighbor's stolen car or one of my constituents that happens to be running in for a cup of coffee or getting gas or anything like that. In fact, I can't find any statistic that bears that out. Certainly, there is a lot of gun crime that goes on in the state of Connecticut. I would suggest that it's gang-related. I would suggest that it's drug-related. I would suggest that it's turf. And certainly those guns came from somewhere, because most of the people that commit those guns, especially under the age of 21, can't legally own them. They can't even possess them. I worked with Senator Looney back when we passed 1160, and I remember a long conversation he and I had about the drug trade and how it's part of the cost of narcotics in some cases, that not only firearms, but firearms and ammunition end up finding their way into the system, because the money is no good if they can't protect their corner. And it makes sense to me. I'm just not sure that passing another law here, in fact, I'm quite sure that passing another law here, written this way, is necessarily going to help that situation. Madam President, I have been fortunate to enjoy firearms use since the age of 14. And that's why the bill that we passed was very important to me, both for what it attempted to correct and what I wanted to try and make sure we didn't create. If we are going to continue to pass laws that don't respect people's right to engage in lawful activity with firearms, I'm afraid the incidence of illegal activity and the incidence of accidental activity are only going to increase. I know many people in my district under the age of 21 that either have a hunting license, belong to a shooting club, may engage in firearms activities, even in association with a school program. Some have been accepted at college. Some have gone on to the military, and they have learned how to handle, how to store, how to control, how to clean, everything to do with a firearm. And I would suggest to this chamber that that's what we should be trying to focus on. In the bill that we passed, certainly there's an education component. I honestly hope that someone takes action on that component. I don't think we need to pass a law that says I've got to take a handgun and lock it up in a box somewhere. It's necessarily going to make it any better. I think I would agree with Senator Champagne. I'm almost getting tired of having to defend my right to own something, whether it's jewelry in my house or something in my automobile, and that somehow society seems to be accepting of the fact that it's just part of life. You got something somebody else wants, they got a right to take it. And I don't think that's the case. I can guarantee you that is not the case in my house. And so, Madam President, I do think there's a big difference between leaving a gun on the dashboard of my car and having to secure it in a way that somehow we think it's more appropriate because it is going to somehow change the statistics. I don't know anyone that owns one of these firearms that would think leaving a loaded firearm or a firearm on the dashboard of their car is acceptable or appropriate. It goes against every bit of training anyone has ever gotten. And if something happens with it, they should face whatever the penalties are. But this is not going to change, in my estimation, gun violence one bit. And more than likely, we're going to have another category on this list that has more nollies on it than convictions. And that new category is going to be failure to store the firearm in a vehicle appropriately, and then 100% of those are going to be nollied. Or, frankly, maybe because it's someone who lawfully owned a gun, they'll get prosecuted. And I think that'll be the worst possible outcome. So I do not rise in support of the bill. I am opposed to it. And I thank the chamber.
Thank you, Senator Minor. Will you remark further on the bill that is before us? Will you remark further on the bill that is before us? If not, Mr. Clerk, if you would please call the roll and the machine will be open.
Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate on House Bill 7223. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate on House Bill 7223. Immediate roll call vote in the Senate, House Bill 7223. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate on House Bill 7223. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate.
Have all the senators voted? Have all the senators voted? The machine will be locked, and Mr. Clerk, if you would kindly announce the tally.
House Bill 7223, total number voting 35, total voting yea 20, total voting nay 15, absent, not voting 1.
The legislation is adopted.